I'd like to point out just a few things in the two articles. The first one by George Schindler is more than 40 years old, but it represents a type of authority which is still appealed to today, even in some textbooks, which we might call anecdotal authority, which basically means the authority based on experience. I've read more, I've written for a longer period of time, says the person claiming to this sort of authority, and it's really more often authority as a writer than as an editor. Schindler's claim to authority in this article is simply that he's a senior IEEE member, Institute for Electrical Electronic Engineers, and he's been editing for a long time. And that's where he's come up with this advice, and he's passing it on to you. That was the most common form of advice for years and years. Gopen and Swan, however, speak with an analytical authority developed from linguistic research, specifically statistically verifiable studies. Studies that have control groups that are put together to examine how readers respond to different grammatical transformations. There's also a whole group of these called usability studies, often used for instructions, software manuals to see how readers can actually use the document. And it's not just style they look at, but the design of the document itself. So this is quantitative research, and it's really much more convincing. Certainly in a technical context, it's more convincing. So it's not really that one form of authority is better than the other, but the analytical authority is probably more convincing because the research exists now. That research wasn't there 50 years ago. It is there now. For example, you'll probably recall our noun style, verb style table from the Head First editing discussion. This table actually comes from a style manual at Sandia National Labs. But in that style manual, the author of the style manual called noun style, the group of words on the left, weak and wordy writing. And verb style was labeled strong, direct writing. I'm the one who said it's actually noun style, verb style, because those are the terms that derive from analytical approaches to editing. Whereas calling something weak and wordy or strong and direct, as you can see, those are qualitative descriptors that come from that anecdotal school. And if you'll notice, it's not just an anecdotal approach or an appeal to authority. It almost has a moral dimension to it. Weak and wordy. I can't imagine an author who would like to have his or her writing described as weak and wordy. But if you go to an author and say, I notice there's a lot of noun style here, let's look at the nouns. And this has happened to me in my experience. The author's likely to say, noun style, what's that? They'll recognize the nouns. It's a way to work with authors about their style without being judgmental. So let's look at the articles and see specifically what I'm talking about here. If we go to the end of this first column, he's talking about sentence length, but notice he says that problems of sentence length are not that easily solved. So it's just descriptive. He doesn't really have any specific advice for how to deal with a symptom, which is a long sentence, because he's not really looking at what causes the symptom to occur. The discussion of passive voice is even more revelatory of the difference between these approaches. It's an obvious feature of the writing of scientists and engineers. Now, one of the things I like to point out about this article is that the advice he gives is actually good advice. And that is that there are times when in this community the passive voice is actually appropriate. But when it's just by force of habit that someone writes in the passive voice, not so appropriate. Notice that the advice here is absolutely pretty good. It says the report outlined and the new equipment design, and a new equipment design, and it described. So we've got an action verb and an action verb here. The same kind of thing that we were talking about. Same thing here with nouns instead of verbs. His advice is quite good. but his appeal is simply, here's what I've seen in my reading and editing of writing. He can't tell us why noun style writing causes problems, and that's what noun for a verb, noun instead of verb style is. It's noun style. And I'm afraid over here with which instead of that, when we start looking at the history of rules of English usage, you're going to find that this is one of those non-rules. There really isn't a difference between which and that in the usage of even the best writers. Gopen and Swan, on the other hand, are offering you the science of scientific writing. The reader is to grasp what the writer means. The writer must understand what the reader needs. Writing for readers. That's what we've been talking about in our approach, and that's what this article takes. It is an analytical approach. He's referring to work done in the fields of rhetoric and in particular linguistics and cognitive psychology. How people read, how people find meaning in a text. So if you want to write with the reader in mind, there are certain things that you do. The interplay between substance and structure. This relates to that earlier lecture in which I said grammar tells a story. It does, and that story often has to do with simple position, left and right. And that's what we have here. Since we read from left to right, we prefer context on the left and then what we might call new information or even content on the right. When we start talking about paragraphs, we'll see how this context, content, given information that we already understand, that we have context for, new information on the right, is a very important thing for putting paragraphs together. Look at the footnotes, or not the footnote, but the bibliographical reference, and you'll see that Joseph Williams's work is what's referenced here. And I want to skip ahead to the subject-verb separation, because here again is something we ought to recognize. It's relatively long, he says, of this sentence, 42 words. But that's not the problem. We've seen sentences of over 100 words that flow easily and persuasively, he says. Length is not the problem. The problem he identifies as grammatical subject separated from the verb by 23 words, more than half the sentence. That's our favorite severed head sentence. So the point is, look at these two articles. See how advice given in Schindler's article, some of that same advice is explained positionally in terms of linguistic commonplace, linguistic research in the Gopen and Swan article.